Tonight, we won't drift through museums or polish the medals of heroes. Instead, we'll follow a hum too quiet for parades, a heartbeat caught between stars and snow. The room is dark but patient. The tape spins, whispering a language made of static and breath. Somewhere in that noise, a name rises and falls, like a signal almost forgotten but not gone. The year is the early 1960s. Radios still glow like small hearths. Two brothers in Turin lean closer to their homemade receivers, chasing voices that were never meant to return. The dials crackle, the air smells of dust and solder, and the signal stumbles across time, carrying something that sounds almost human. If you listen closely, you might hear the shape of distance, the small spaces between truth and what is allowed to be said. So lower the lights. Let the snow in the headphones fall slow and endless. And if your breathing begins to match the faint pulse of a lost transmission, that's just the sky remembering who it almost kept. If quiet mysteries like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next signal will find you there. And somewhere beneath that imagined static, a new voice begins to rise. Not loud, never loud, but certain its rhythm. It crackles through the air like frost learning to speak, traveling from attic to attic, from one curious night to another. The reels turn, steady and unhurried, as if the sound itself is deciding whether it wants to be found. The year folds back on itself. The room narrows to the glow of a single dial. Two brothers lean closer, the way listeners always do when the story is about to begin. On their aerials, the brothers heard steady tones that a manual would call telemetry, and then they heard other sounds a manual would not know where to shelve. A man's breath hitching when the pitch shifts, a woman's voice on the edge of overheating, coded numbers that were not quite the numbers the newspapers printed. Those numbers, the printed ones, ran to crisp headlines about triumphs. The taped ones wandered down hallways with bare feet. The brothers logged each pass with a pencil, plotted Doppler curves that rose and fell like a ferry crossing a slow river, then compared the curves to a globe on the desk. Some nights the curve said a craft was high and healthy. Other nights the curve warbled as though the craft were a thrown stone arguing with wind. Their equipment, nothing glamorous, was good enough to capture a feeling that official bulletins airbrushed away. That space exploration was a collection of very human sounds, many of them weary, some of them embarrassed, a few stubbornly administrative. When the tape hinted at heat, the room stayed cool. When the voice thinned, the brothers thickened their notes. They were not trying to scandalize. They were doing what night people do, keeping gentle watch while morning built its confidence. Across different longitudes, radio amateurs listened to, stringing wire between chimneys and calling it an observatory. They traced phantom orbits in pocket notebooks, the pencil lines looping like lazy lariats. Some curves matched what everyone expected, passing over the poles on reliable schedules, little metronomes with names. Others appeared where no announced path should be. They swaggered in briefly and disappeared like shy comets. The amateurs compared reception times on postcards, that very analog method that asks the post office to collate science. A few claimed they heard countdowns that came from somewhere official and then didn't lead to anywhere public. A few heard nothing but themselves hearing. And because the atmosphere loves to play, voices skipped across layers of air and landed where they had no business landing. So a test in Kazakhstan might flirt with an attic in Kent. Picture a family in pajamas listening to someone who thinks no one is listening. Picture the way a living room goes polite when a stranger's breathing is present, the television lowered by instinct, the lamp trimmed as if brightness were rude. The sky offers data. Interpretation chooses a story. Dinner cools, and it is all very normal. What the tapes seemed to show and what the papers showed were cousins, not twins. Official photographs of training classes lost one face here and there, the rows tightening as if a tailor had come through with a quiet needle. Magazine captions that had once been rich with adjectives flattened into brisk nouns, a sign, perhaps, that editors had been asked to favor nouns for a while. Personnel lists cited allergic reactions to cold as reasons for transfers during months when the real cold was in space. Medals for outstanding parachutists stopped appearing in columns without anyone saying that outstanding. Parachutists do not always return to Earth by parachute. Launch manifests picture pads unused on Wednesday and scorched on Thursday. Archivists, tidy people with sharp pencils, drew rectangles of black ink over places where a date would have told an inconvenient joke. Drawers locked, keys multiplied. Keys lost themselves like conscientious mice. A pad could be said to host a rehearsal, a test, a technicality, an adjustment, a necessary correction to a headline, so many nice words for flame and loudness. If history is a lung, you can hear it inhale the impressive and exhale the incomplete. Meanwhile, engineering lived at the edge where confidence hums and screws ask for one more quarter turn. Before any person wrote a capsule, mannequins did, their cloth hearts undisturbed, leaving engineers to measure everything except fear. Dogs wrote too, noble and confused, contributing data that no dog would have requested. In one accident, a stage meant to understand the sky misunderstood a second instruction, and the field taught everybody how quickly a celebration can step backward into paperwork. Clerks work forward from ashes. Doctors work backward from smoke. The designer wakes from a short nap and joins them with a pencil, promising to draw a safer circle around tomorrow. It was all heroic, but it did not always look like what posters prefer. People wore wool under flight suits, carried talismans in pockets, and taped notes with household words beside switches that already had serious names. Breathe first, says a little scrap of paper, as if a brain part might forget. What to announce, what to delay, what to place carefully in a drawer while time sands off the corners. These were policy questions with gentle faces. A perfect orbit invites trumpets. A partial one invites editorial letters. Telemetry was handled like naval codes. A country whose rivals listen learns the beauty of saying nothing and discovers, perhaps, that saying nothing is restful. A training death on a Tuesday can be reported on a Saturday as a car accident if the geography is carefully drafted and the morning knows how to read maps. A capsule that flirted with space for 80 seconds can be called a high-altitude research vehicle. A parachute that half-worked can be called a protective system with opportunities for improvement. This is not conspiracy so much as the quiet etiquette of institutions which always try to keep their sentences tidy. Monuments are patient, plaques wait. Spreadsheets study themselves in neat columns. In a ledger, the column for lessons learned eventually becomes longer than the column for lessons announced. Back in the snow, because there is always snow in these stories, the tapes were weighed like fruit at a market. Engineers, historians, and a few glamorous skeptics measured the signals against known orbits. Doppler shift against Earth's fat curve, compression artifacts against the ticks of old transmitters. A beeping that seemed to quicken could be explained by a pass near the horizon. A voice that sounded like panic could be a filter working too energetically. A long sigh might be nothing more than a microphone lying closer to a throat. The atmosphere, which likes to gossip, reflects and refracts. A recording from an aircraft can impersonate a satellite with embarrassing confidence. If you listen carefully, many of the ghosts turn out to be reflections of living people. But not all. There remain fragments that resist neatness, a voting tone that fits an orbit we can draw, a heartbeat that seems to slow in a way that, while explainable, continues to feel like someone wearing a suit and wishing for shade. The verdict is not a verdict. It is a quilt stitched from fragments, worn without declaring weather, folded and placed where you can reach for it later. The idea of lost cosmonauts sits at a particular temperature. Too hot, and it becomes melodrama. Too cold, and it freezes into cynicism. Held in a hand, it is room temperature, a possibility that doesn't demand attention but accepts it if offered. What we can say calmly is that people train very hard, that some left by doors smaller than the doors they entered, that paperwork loves euphemism the way yeast loves warmth, and that recordings from the sky arrived in kitchens not built for mysteries. A short list of salmon-colored facts repeats itself like a lullaby. A few names became shy in photographs. A few stopwatches stopped at inconvenient minutes. A few launch pads looked busy on days when press tours were not permitted, because press tours would have clapped at the wrong time. You can add one more fact if you want. The brothers in Turin boiled spaghetti near their radios and learned to eat quietly, so the microphones on their tables did not pick up dinner and misfile it as drama. Think also about watches on wrists. Official watches recorded official times. Personal watches recorded personal heartbeats. A notebook reads, "Pass successful." Signal clear, and a line so straight it seems ironed. A private diary reads, "The shift grew long. The tea was strong." She is nervous in a way only the brave people are, and a ring of moisture marks the page where the cup sat. The space program, any space program, is not one story, but two stacked bunk beds of stories. The upper bunk is national, brisk, tidy. The lower bunk is human, rumpled, affectionate. Lying on either bunk, you hear the other breathing. You are welcome to switch bunks now and then to stretch your back, or to dangle your arm over the side and touch the hand hanging down from above. The habit of switching bunks is called perspective, and is what museums try to stamp onto tickets in friendly fonts. We can take a small tour of desks without leaving our chair. On one desk lies a stack of medical discharges citing arrhythmia. A word that means rhythm is exploring other hobbies. On another, larger desk, a map with arcs drawn in blue pencil and the note, "Repeat pass if available," which is like asking the moon to walk by again so we can admire the shoes. In a drawer, a tangle of lanyards with badges that no longer open doors, but still believe they could. On a windowsill, a plant that did not notice the historic decade and only noticed sunlight. History is full of windowsills that missed everything important and thereby kept everything alive. The plant's job is to be a plant. The tape's job is to remember. Our job is to yawn without rudeness and keep reading. There is an ordinary kindness in how engineers label things. Thermal interface material, do not forget. Seal retainer, please mind. Insulation blanket, yes blanket. The closer you get to the harshness of vacuum, the more the language leans toward blankets, hoods, caps, gloves, umbilicals, cradles. Someone even called a cable a lifeline and meant it both technically and tenderly. When we hear a voice saying it grows hot on a tape, we can hear the human body measuring its situation and reporting honestly. We can also hear the tidy nouns on the engineer's table blanket cap rustle a little, as though sympathetic. The universe is harsh, but the labels are soft, and both are true at once. This is in its own sleepy way reassuring. Now, about those gaps, some gaps are innocence, some are intention, most are maintenance. A film can be patched, copied, and fixed into a version that behaves when threaded. Along the way, a frame blisters and is replaced by a frame that smiles more naturally. A list can be updated to reflect the shape of a team this morning, and the morning after that, and after a while, the mornings swallow a name the night remembers. A photograph can be cropped because a background clock told a time an editor prefers not to discuss, and suddenly the room looks cleaner. None of this is exceptional. It is the housekeeping of institutions. The space race ran on housekeeping, polishing, filing, recalibrating, trimming the wick of a rumor, topping up the tea. Under the thunder were many little brooms. Skeptics ask for certainties, and they are right to. Believers ask for reverence, and they are sincere too. Most of us ask for neither and are content to be comforted by competent ambiguity. The best kind of ambiguity is the kind that has done its homework. We understand how ionospheric skip can clone voices. We understand how a ground test can impersonate a low orbit. We understand how a microphone can compress a plea into a simple vowel. After we understand, there is still a small remainder in the sum, like a coin that will not fit a stack, not big enough to buy anything, not small enough to ignore. It sits on the counter and glints. In that glint lives the story of people we cannot confidently name, doing hard things the sky barely acknowledged. If you look at the glint for a while, you start to see your own reflection, which is always a sign that the history is doing its job. At some point in this gentle detour, a human crossed night alone. We do not need to know the name to know the posture, knees pretending not to tremble, breath counting itself, hands memorizing the angle to a switch. The hull was a kind stove for a little while and then a cool kettle. The air learned to be thrifty. The horizon behaved like a belt too tight on one side and too loose on the other. Perhaps there was a song half remembered but forgotten out of politeness toward mission control. Perhaps there was nothing but arithmetic, which is a song that never learned lyrics. A heartbeat beat, a microphone listened. Someone in an attic heard both and wrote a date very neatly on a label, because neatness is what we have when we cannot offer rescue. If we linger at the window before closing the blinds, we can see how the story has decided to live with us. It visits in documentary fragments and interviews with hair carefully combed, in museum displays where headphones hang from hooks like patient animals, and arguments that begin loudly and end with someone saying, perhaps. The beeps still drift like frost through old speakers, and they still ask the same quiet question they asked when the brothers first swallowed their noodles and leaned closer. Who was out there first heard but never announced? The answer is a kind citizen who folds blankets and labels boxes and sleeps badly the night before a big day. The answer is probably plural. The answer is also that we cannot be sure, and that not being sure is a peaceful place to set the cup down. Elsewhere, the official roll of honor is long and rightly so. Names form constellations on plaques. Families visit. School children look up and learn to draw circles with compass points that have meaning. The roll glows. The tapes hum on their shelves. Between the glow and the hum sits the rest of us, learning the art of listening without interrogating. You can imagine, if you like, an archive that breathes, the metal cabinets in a faint duet with the building's lungs. You can imagine a night watchman who has heard the snow crackle on the radio and prefers it to music. You can imagine a small sign on a door that says quiet calibration and a larger sign that says no photography, and both signs meaning please be kind. The cables sag a little. The room keeps its promises. We are near the end, but not at a conclusion, because conclusions are busy people and we are not. The brothers in Turin still rewind the tape in our memory, and the little plastic reel turns politely, mindful of its age. The phantom orbits remain friendly ghosts that accept a biscuit and do not rearrange furniture. The gaps in paper sit in their rectangles like shy guests who brought dessert but are not sure when to place it on the table. Rockets keep their patience in museums and tell jokes to strollers on rainy Tuesdays. Scientists in Snow Way signals again, and the scale, as always, is balanced and undecided and beautifully domestic. If you're still awake, the headphones can come off now and rest on the hook. If you are almost asleep, you can let them go gently around your neck and trust that the faint beeps will stay faint. The tape clicks softly, the room dimly approves, and the night busy elsewhere with clouds and postcards reminds us to breathe in, breathe out, and file the breath under ordinary. You might not expect the exact curve of a wire loop to explain a century of desks, but it does, and it does so in a voice that sounds like stationary whispering from a drawer it never left. The ordinary paperclip, calm as a sleeping cat, sits there with its two little ovals and does nothing dramatic, which is exactly how it wins. A stack of pages breathes out, a hand lines the edges with the back of a pencil. and the clip glides on with the practiced grace of a tiny trombone that declined to learn music. Early makers called the familiar shape the gem, as if it were something found in gravel and rinsed in a cup. Shops sold them in boxes of 100, never 99, or 101, because numbers like order as much as office managers do. If you were still awake later when we talk about wire diameter changing from 0.9 millimeter to 0.8 because of wartime, conservation, feel free to subscribe, or just let the box lid close softly and consider that a subscription to quiet. Either way, the loop remains the same. One turn hugging another turn, friendly, undecorated, endlessly polite. The paperclip is a simple device with a complicated social life. Its shape is two nearly parallel runs of springy wire that disagree just enough to make friction. When the runs are too close, the clip bites and leaves little crescent moons on the paper. When too far, it sighs and lets the pages escape like autumn leaves. Manufacturers learned to drift between those moods by listening to the wire. Annealed steel spoke one dialect, brass another, and tinned music told a third, bright and plinky. In factory light that was more practical than flattering, spools of wire unwound like cautious serpents toward bending machines with patient jaws. A measured push, a measured swivel, a measured cut. The same dance repeated so many thousands of times that even the machines might have felt the urge to hum. You can imagine a foreman holding a caliper in a sandwich, measuring a curve while butter introduces itself to paperwork. The sandwiches mattered because the clips had to decide how many pages counted as a few, and the chart on the wall suggested answers that taste like mayonnaise. No. 1 for thin reports. No. 3 for thicker specialty sizes for the truly optimistic. A paperclip that accepts too much optimism is called a binder clip, but that comes later and brings its own appetite. Before there was the graceful gem, there were enthusiastic near misses. Ticket clerks used a wire fastener that looked like a seagull drawn by a hurried child. It clamped a tag to cloth the way a crab clamps a toe. There were straight pins with elaborate warnings about puncture wounds, clever staples that promised to behave, and then insisted on ceremonies with staplers, and there were patents for loops so ornate they would rather be jewelry. The charming myth about a Norwegian inventor drawing the gem shape on a napkin survives because people like napkins. The more truthful tale says British workshops spent something similar in the 1890s while a set of earlier patents in America filed different slightly awkward loops under the handsome title of paper fasteners. This is the sleepest kind of controversy. Who first asked a wire to remember 2 turns at once? The wire, for its part, remained neutral and asked only for a light oil and a room without excessive drafts. If you examine a familiar clip, you will find that its inside loop ends just a little shorter than its outside loop, a modesty that helps the nose slide under the first page without snagging. That nose, the technical term could be tip, but nose is better for bedtime, of course, cannot be too sharp or too blunt. Sharp tips score paper. Blunt ones humiliate themselves on every attempt. Some makers rounded the nose with a tiny burnishing disc, a kiss of heat that left a barely visible halo. Other makers dipped the tips in nickel or zinc, a kind of metallic nail polish that improved slip and resisted rust. During wet seasons, office supplies absorb weather the way cats absorb moods. A box of dull steel clips in a damp post room behaves like a species that missed the instructions for living on land. The box furrows its brow and collects freckles. Hence the coatings, hence the carefully chosen paper for the box, hence the advice to store the lot in a dry place, which is exactly where every building secretly wishes to be stored. If the clip's biography were written like a family registry, its cousins would be a long list of optimists and reformers. The ideal had a little hump like a camel that agreed to carry 1 extra page. The owl's head looked as if it might blink when you weren't looking. The Niagara pretended to be a tiny bridge and kept a shy confidence about the number of pages it could span. The butterfly clip, later called the binder, arrived with a grin that said it could hold a phone book by the ears and not apologize. Each cousin betrayed what it thought of work. The gem believed in restraint. The binder believed in stubborn affection. The humpbacked ones believed in compromise. The owl believed in observing policy. There were heart-shaped clips for Valentines sent by procurement to accounting. There were triangular clips that held pages with the thin authority of geometry. All functioned. None displaced the gem. It kept winning because it vanished. Good hardware knows how to be forgettable. On desks, the clip lives a life of small errands. It groups receipts for a day and carries them across the office like a well-mannered insect. It keeps a letter with its reply draft so the conversation doesn't wander off. It marks an important page by quietly making it less important to remember. Later, the eye finds the clip, and the clip finds the place. People idly bend clips into miniature tools without asking permission. They become reset pins for gadgets trying to learn to behave. They become hooks for Christmas ornaments, tiny shovels for tangles in carpets, diagnostic wands for the rare moment when a friend's phone needs a SIM tray opened and everyone looks around as if the right person will raise a hand. Clips straighten and become keys for cans of condensed milk, if you live in a certain decade. Clips become sculptures on Wednesday afternoons when meetings are longer than anyone's attention but shorter than the millennium. A single clip travels farther in its career than some suitcases. There's a quiet comedy in how standards approach such a humble loop. Trade catalogs specify spring temper, which sounds like a season when people bounce. Engineers identify wire gauges with numerals that face the wrong direction. Higher numbers sometimes mean thinner wire because numbering, like history, learned to count before it learned to agree. A specification table announces that a clip should be 33 millimeters long, plus or minus a millimeter, which is a generous kindness in a world where rulers pretend to be stern. Another table explains that nickel resists sweaty hands better than timeless steel does, which could be taken as a gentle critique of meetings more than a metallurgical fact. Box labels whisper, made in England, made in the USA, made in any place where paper believes in itself, and the typography tries to look brisk, as if to reassure the buyer that nothing romantic is happening here. The romance, of course, is all over the carpet disguised as lint. War finds the paperclip and asks it to represent things. In one country, the loop stands in for a national habit of fastening without force. In another, it sits on a lapel to say a quiet no to occupation. Resistance loves symbols that can pass through checkpoints. Wire learns to speak code without ever learning to speak. It is disproportionate, the way a little bow of metal becomes a crowded idea, but history always needs props and paper clips learn their lines on the way to work. After the parades and the difficult piece, the clip resumes its ordinary job with a shrug that only wire can do, a sort of relaxed recoil, a readiness to return to shape. This is the clip's true superpower. It forgets stress in order to be useful again. If you could buy that trick in a bottle, you would, and it would sit beside the coffee machine, promising to make afternoons friendlier. Let us drift for a moment into the factory where loops are born. The machine that bends wire sings out a note you can feel in your jaw. A spool taller than a person turns with the authority of something that no longer needs to prove it is round. Workers carry little trays lined with felt so that the new clips do not bruise one another. Every so often, a tray is emptied into a counting scale, and the scale, bored by glory, translates weight into quantity. 100 fall into a waiting box with a sound like a soft rain on a roomy umbrella. Someone folds the lid, tucks the little tongue into the little slot, and the small cardboard fatigue becomes inventory. If the day is ordinary, a forklift arrives with a pallet, and the pallet says in its wooden voice that the world is, if not peaceful, at least willing to proceed. Boxes leave for shops, shops breathe out into briefcases. Briefcases breathe out onto desks. The chain of exhales a chain of loops. Nothing urgent, just civilization tidying itself. The science of the clip is equally drowsy and oddly satisfying. Steel remembers because its crystals are arranged like a crowd that knows how to sway without falling. When the wire is pulled into shape, the crowd commits the choreography to muscle memory. If you overbend a clip and it does not return, that is not failure so much as retirement. A veteran has earned a nap in the drawer. Surface coatings change how water beads. Nickel sends droplets wandering off like kids who saw a better game. Zinc stands there and takes the weather like a stoic relative at a wedding. Powder-coated clips in pastel colors look like candy that studied engineering. Black clips look like they know state secrets. Gold-colored clips are perfect for making ordinary invoices feel as if they're going to a party. All of them hold pages with the same little press of friction. You can calculate the clamping force, and engineers sometimes do, then go to lunch with faces that say they have done enough for now. A rumor says every office has a place where paper clips go to escape, perhaps a vent or a carpet seam that accepts them as offerings. The true story is less magical. Clips migrate by habit, carried in cuffs, lifted by magnetic staplers, swept to the baseboards by a janitor who understands entropy but charges by the hour. At the end of a quarter, someone empties a drawer to appease a supervisor who prefers nouns to verbs. In that drawer, the paper clips have formed a colony, a culture with its own archaeological layers, the bright ones near the surface, the dull ones below, a stray safety pin like a fossil, a coin from a country that once changed its money for ideological reasons, and at the very bottom, a crushed peppermint asserting the colonial right of sweets to appear in every human drawer. The clips are rescued, smoothed, sorted, and returned to service. They bear no grudges. Metal rarely does. In libraries, paper clips are both friends and enemies. A rusting clip can imprint a ghost on a margin the way a pressed leaf imprints summer. Archivists prefer stainless steel, neutral pH folders, unbleached boxes, and an unadvertised prayer for funding. Some whisper a house rule: never leave a clip in a book after closing time. Clips understand. They lie still beside the stack like pets obediently, not on the couch. Yet historians opening a box of letters often breathe fondly when a clip appears where a person once made an intention. A particular letter was connected to a list once. A summer included 2 receipts and a note that a cousin borrowed a hat. A clip holds them together still, a metallic memory of an afternoon. The nose slips under the page again, as if rehearsing the moment it first did so, a small encore granted by paper to wire. There's a spiritual twin to the paper clip that sits 2 drawers away, the rubber band. Where the clip believes in firm, modest grip, the band believes in a hopeful embrace that sometimes ages into a brittle philosophy on the subject of limits. Bands crumble, clips endure. This is not a competition. Both have their holidays, but it does mean that end of year. Closets often reveal a diaspora of bands behaving like dry autumn, while clips sit blinking mildly from their boxes as if to ask whether anyone would like to talk about page order again. The band's obituary is dust. The clip's retirement plan is to be straightened and pressed into one last service as a tool for a reset hole too small for fingers. Dignity all around. Culturally, the clip also plays cameo roles. A magician pulls one through another, though the trick is mostly misdirection, and the quiet competence of wire pretending not to notice its own flexibility. A schoolchild strings 3 into a chain and triumphantly holds up a bit of jewelry that somehow looks like the water cycle. A novelist writes an entire chapter with 2 sheets clipped together because the symbolism pleases a character who has just discovered how to be neat. In an old comedy, a clerk straightens a clip to clean fingernails and never makes any progress. The joke is on the nails. The clip has other responsibilities. In a slow afternoon class, a bright student invents a catapult with a rubber band and a clip, recreating the medieval siege in miniature while learning about consequences. Teachers confiscate without anger. Paper clips have immunity in schools. They will be back. Let us return to the geometry for a moment because it is the gentlest of all subjects. Two turns of wire, almost parallel, create opposing slopes. The page meets a slope and is persuaded to climb because paper is obedient to gentle arguments. At the summit of the slope, another slope refuses the descent just enough to keep everyone in place. You could call it a truce. The forces are small, a fraction of a newton here, a little spring constant there. Engineers fill notebooks with such fractions and sleep well afterward. If you were to magnify the contact point between clip and page, you would see fibers like a field and wire like a polished path across it. The wire slides, but also listens to the field. Friction is a conversation, not a battle. That is why the clip works without damage when it is made thoughtfully, and why cheap clips chew. No one wants to be chewed by an office supply. On the day a binder clip enters the story, nobody feels threatened. The binder is a little theater. It opens its black mouth, sings a note, and closes with a click that insists on applause. It is useful and indiscreet. The paperclip, hearing the performance, inclines its head and takes exactly none of it personally. They share territory and never quarrel. A wise desk keeps both and knows which to send where. Binder clips to meetings where enthusiasm outnumbers agenda. Paper clips to letters that plan to spend the afternoon in envelopes and the evening in a bowl near a door waiting for a walk. Territorial peace of this sort is rare and therefore restful. Stationery shows us how to distribute attention without resentment. Give the binder fame, give the clip tenure. Toward evening, the office grows the narrow quiet that belongs to buildings after footfalls have retired. A draft notices a light memo, and a paperclip notices the draft and suddenly becomes a citizen hero, adding exactly the gram that prevents drama. In the corner, a printer sleeps noisily, the way tired comedians sleep. In the kitchenette, a mug recognizes a ring of tea as destiny. On a desk, 3 clips test their balance by standing up on one leg, a pastime someone invented and then forgot to claim. The clips never fall. They practice balance better than people practice patience. You could line them across the wood like a procession of tiny gymnasts, and not one would develop ego. If a custodian opens a window, the line stays steady. If a computer restarts itself with a flourish, the line yawns and continues. A building full of paper clips is a building inoculated against melodrama. Near the end of our study, we should talk about what clips cannot do, because limits are kindness. They do not bind forever. They do not survive campfires. They ground no electricity safely. They cannot, no matter how well bent, keep all the pages of a novel together if the reader is determined to read while jogging. They are not good as fish hooks unless the fish in question is extremely easygoing. They will not unlock a heart except in poems. A clip's job is to keep a few sheets honest while they learn what to do next. In this, the clip resembles a counselor with excellent boundaries and reasonable rates. At last the day ends, and the last desk lamp makes a circle of patience around a stack of pages held by a small, ordinary piece of wire that learned to be helpful by bending twice and thinking once. The stack is not urgent, the night is not dramatic, the history is not loud. Facts line up in the kind way facts sometimes do. A British workshop, a few. American patents, a Norwegian myth, a world's worth of drawers, a lapel in a dangerous time, a spool and a humming. Room boxes of 100 going out the door as if 100 were the correct shape for fairness. Somewhere a child slides a clip onto a drawing and calls the drawing finished, and the clip agrees. Somewhere a clerk clips a receipt to a report and calls the day finished, and the clip agrees. Somewhere you slide one onto a page and the tiny friction says yes, and that is enough. If you're still with me, let the loop sit where it is. It isn't going anywhere. It never does, and somehow that is what holds everything together. You might not expect a grocery list carved into a stick to outlive a palace, But that's the sort of quiet miracle medieval accounting specialized in. A tally stick looks like a piece of firewood that learned to count. It sits in the hand with grain going one way, knife marks going the other, and history content to take the long route between them. A clerk, who is not in a hurry because numbers behave better when nobody hurries, scores a notch for a shilling, a deeper notch for a pound, a thin hatch mark for pennies that misbehave when they're alone. Then he splits the wood lengthwise, clean as a polite disagreement. One half becomes the stalk, the other the foil, and just like that, this small object acquires a vocabulary that will eventually sneak into finance, and botany and the frustrated phrase out of stock. If you still awake when we reach the bit about the centuries-old sticks accidentally burning down a government building, feel free to subscribe. Or close your eyes and let the wood grain do the subscribing for you. Either way, the math will keep. The tally stick's first magic trick is that it refuses to be forged. Split wood remembers itself. When the two halves reunite their ribs and valleys knit together like old friends finishing, a sentence and no forger with a knife and optimism can imitate the exact path the fibers took when the clerk, his iron blade, persuaded them to part. A debtor holds one half, a creditor the other. Both halves travel through weather that treats parchment unkindly, and when they meet again, the truth is not performed but fitted. The clerk, confident with the quiet pride of someone whose job involves labeling notches, writes names along the face in a hand that looks stern even when it is friendly. He might use Latin if it's a serious tax, French if the lord is feeling continental, English if the weather insists on practicality. Dates arrive as Roman numerals that seem taller than the wood is long. Meanwhile, the notches do the heavy lifting. A long V means a pound. A notch shallow as a sigh means a farthing, which is not much but still needs a place to live. Wood species matter and do not matter, the way pillows matter and do not matter when you're already sleepy. Hazel behaves like a well-brought-up citizen. Willow is easier to split than to argue with. Poplar is light, which pleases a messenger who must carry 50 records while pretending to stroll. Each stick is dried a little so it splits cleanly, but not so much that it sulks and cracks of its own accord. Clerks who live near rivers prefer riverwood because riverwood understands patience. In winter, the sticks breathe less and work more. In summer, they expand like opinions. If the day is damp, the clerk warms the blade at the brazier, so the cut is a conversation, not a quarrel. He has a little box of blades, some sharp like new decisions, some dull like old policy. The bench shows shallow grooves where years of stalks and foils learn to separate without complaint. You might imagine a cat. There is always a cat in a medieval office, sleeping on the finished bundles, convinced it is supervising. Tally sticks didn't begin in royal treasuries. They began wherever people needed to remember a transaction that preferred wood to memory. A shepherd scores a stick when he lends a neighbor 2 ewes and receives nothing yet but gratitude. A miller would rather not argue about how many sacks he has ground this season, so the sacks declare themselves in sharp wooden syllables. The fishmonger, the brewer, the tollkeeper who is not supposed to nap but does. Each likes the way a split tally makes truth portable. A stick with 10 little beaks in it remembers geese better than a head full of errands. Eventually, the habit travels upward, as habits do, and sits in treasuries beside wax tablets and seals that smell of bees. And clerks whose job description is basically turn chaos into columns approve, because a tally is a column you can hold. Paper exists but sulks. Ink is expensive. Mice think parchment is a salad. Wood grins and gets on with it. They're accustomed to the carving. Notches are cut on the tall edge, not the wide face, because debt likes to stand up straight. Each notch slants toward the tip, so the cut, once split, shows up proudly on both halves. If a payment is partial, the clerk shows mercy and the notch grows shorter, a small haircut to acknowledge good behavior. If the payer is a lord whose horse occupies more attention than arithmetic, the clerk adds a flourish to the name but not to the numbers, because money does not curtsy. When the sum is complicated, the clerk keeps a private tally in his head and checks it against the wood double entry in embryo. His knife knows when he hesitates. You can almost hear the blade waiting. Is this 7 shillings truly 7, or is it 5 and later 2? The blade, like a witness, prefers clarity. News travels by tally the way rumors travel by humans. A sheriff arrives with a bundle tied up in something that used to be a shirt, and the exchequer, the government. Counting table with the old chessboard cloth receives the sticks like letters from districts that resisted pens but accepted trees. The tablecloth has squares because someone long ago decided that squares soothe numbers. The clerk unties the bundle and lays the sticks by size, long for large debts, short for tiny obligations the weather might forget. He reads names aloud in a voice that can be heard over boots. Another clerk places the government's half of each stick into pigeonholes that have learned by routine to call themselves files. If an auditor arrives, he is offered a stool, a small beer, and the wood. Auditors who hate wood find other careers. The exchequer loves wood because wood can be counted by candlelight while everyone is unreasonably calm. A tiny irony: when the stick is split, the government keeps the stock, the crown's proof. The pair takes the foil, so-called, because it lies against the other half when united. In later centuries, stock and stockholder will stand for ownership of modern enterprises that rarely smell of sap. The tree grows metaphors as enthusiastically as it once grew leaves. You could say capital learned to be capital by being something you can hold in a fist. Meanwhile, back at the counting table, someone asks for more twine because bundles have a way of quietly increasing like families. A senior clerk marks a dozen sticks with a red wash to indicate they have traveled safely from the sheriff's hand to the exchequer as memory. A junior clerk drops one and flinches as it clatters, and the noise sounds like someone scattering toothpicks at a sermon. The tally system adores repetition. Tax seasons pile up like winter logs. Fields produce wheat, and wheat produces obligations, and obligations arrive in the form of wood with stories in it. One stick shows a name that once rode a warhorse. Another shows a widow's tenants, stew of small notches that together feed a kingdom. There are sticks that never reunite lost in floods, used as kindling by a tired innkeeper, chewed by goats who lacked context, and their absences recorded by silence. Accountants develop a calm face for the moment when two halves want to meet because one half became soup. Replacement is possible but never exact. Wood, like people, gives guarantees with conditions. This is part of its charm and part of its audit trail. The second magic trick of tally sticks is how they grow into architecture by accident. Over generations, cupboards become timber-bird with debt. Imagine opening a wall and discovering a forest that learned to count. Houses lean slightly because history has weight. Cabinet makers reinforce shelves to bear the arithmetic. A visiting official taps a bundle and says, "That was the year of the very wet summer, because the notches for barley rose like a choir." Another points to a stick thin as a quill and says, "That was the year we forgave the ferry, because a bridge happened and a debt didn't." Whole communities learned to read the tally room the way sailors read skies. Vertical bundles mean a season when taxes stood upright. Slumped bundles mean harvest that asks for tea and sympathy. None of this is written in law. It is written in wood. We drift now into the years when tallies coexist with paper that is finally confident enough to demand attention. The two tools skate around each other like courteous neighbors who share a fence and affection for early mornings. Receipts on paper rest beside receipts in wood. Ledgers contain little sketches of notches, the same way sketchbooks contain little sketches of birds. When a payment is made, the clerk files the crown stock in a drawer marked satisfied, a word that looks so pleased. with itself on the label that you almost expect it to take a nap. Sometimes the two halves are married permanently with a ribbon, either because romance suits the moment or because the clerk is secretly a tidy person and cannot bear loose ends. The sticks in the satisfied drawer feel lighter, as if wood understands closure. On slow days, a clerk picks up a rejected stick and practices the splits with a new blade, the way a teacher practices neat handwriting with chalk. Another clerk sharpens his knife by drawing it along the back of his belt, a gesture so old it forgets to be theatrical. Someone tells the story of the sheriff who tried to substitute a counterfeit foil and was undone by the wood's stubborn refusal to align. Someone tells the smaller story of a boy who straightened an old tally and used it to measure a window for new glazing beads, thus proving that nothing in the office stays purely symbolic. In a corner, a scribe copies names from wood to paper in case wood meets fire, which is not so much paranoia as experience wearing spectacles. We owe the tallies one last scene, and it is both tidy and a little bit foolish. Centuries pass, governments rehearse new ways to do old tasks. The tally system retires, satisfied with having carried more math than a stick should be asked to carry. The old stocks and foils, some satisfied, some still holding debts that history will mark, doubtful sit in storerooms thick with the smell of dust and renamed rooms. A reformer, tidy-hearted and impatient, decides the bundles should be disposed of because a modern state does not trip over yesterday on its way to tomorrow. The plan is sensible. Paper records exist. The wood is redundant. Fire is a cheap archivist. The day arrives. The furnace assumes its purpose. Tallies feed into the grate like kindling that learned to cue. A draft enters the flue with the confidence of weather. Flames perform their old arithmetic, add air to carbon, subtract history, and then suddenly the fires take the room's opinion too seriously. Heat climbs, timbers remember that they were once trees, and a building of consequence discovers its own appetite. People run, walls argue. The ceilings explain themselves in 1,000 bright pieces. In the morning, the records are gone, and so is the roof. The city, which woke to paperwork, goes to bed with a story about fire. From the tally's point of view, this was a loud exit after a quiet career. From ours, it is an instructive lullaby about the personality of materials. Wood that keeps promises also keeps secrets. It loves dry rooms and hates sudden drafts. It splits along the grain the way rivers follow valleys. It sings when you bend it and aches when you ignore seasons. Whole legal systems once trusted it more than they trusted parchment, not because wood is moral, but because it is honest in a way lawyers understand. Present two halves that are not halves, and the wood declines to marry them. Present two that are, and the wood returns to itself with visible relief. It is rare to find such eagerness for reunions outside of family kitchens and movie endings. You can sleep well knowing that for a few hundred years economics depended on the same principle that guides lost mittens. By now the shape of each notch has probably settled behind your eyelids, the long V of a pound, the generous bite of a mark, the comb of small teeth that remembers pennies. The mind finds these details and files them under comforting facts, along with the knowledge that willows do well in wet places and that cats can supervise arithmetic. If you want a tiny experiment before you drift off, imagine carving your to-do list into a twig. You could assign a deep notch for call back your aunt, a modest nick for water the plant that pretends to be cactus, a sleek cut for renew the thing that definitely expired. And then, because we're a modern break, the twig give half to future you and leave present you with the other half. When the day ends, let the halves meet. If they fit, you did enough. If they don't, the wood will tell you softly where the day wandered. Either way, the twig will be patient. In museums that still tolerate cabinets, you might find a tray of tallies with labels that try for dignity. Exchequer tallies, oak and hazel, 13th, 15th C, while the sticks themselves pretend to be asleep. They lie there with their knife ribs showing like small creatures that bask in afternoon light. Sometimes a curator will place two matching halves together so visitors can see the reunion and feel clever. Sometimes the halves remain apart to honor the suspense that kept governments honest. Children visiting with schools need no explanation. They pick up the idea quicker than the leaflet. You cut a promise into the world. Then you split it, then you wait until the world puts itself back together. Adults nod with the sort of respect we give to simplicity. It is an engineering rule disguised as a proverb. The tally's legacy is everywhere and nowhere. We keep stocks of goods and speak of bonds that once were literal. We tally up, meaning to add, though the original work was really subtracting falsehoods from transactions until truth remained. We like receipts, but still trust the natural genius of a thing that proves itself by fitting. We swipe cards and glance at screens, while craving the relief of closure that would provide it when the two halves met and everyone could walk home. Somewhere an accountant runs a reconciliation and doesn't think of Hazel, yet the echo is there. Two sides of a record, joined by structure, checked by shape. Computers are fast, sticks were confident. Confidence is a technology, and then there's the last, smaller magic trick that tallies perform in memory. They simplify what money is without making it childish. Money is a story about the future told in the tense of wood. This half says you will, that half says we agree, and the grain says time will judge. When the story ends, sometimes in a drawer, sometimes in a furnace, sometimes in a museum label that forgot to include the cat, the stick has done its work and asks only to be allowed to stop being arithmetic. A clerk, if he were here, would set the bundle down, touch the blade to the brazier, let it cool, and put away the knife. He would look at the satisfied drawer and take exactly no credit. He would close the drawer gently because wood likes gentleness. If you're still with me, may your half of the day's tally fit the night's. Let the grain run north-south like a quiet compass. Let the notches be few and tidy. Let the cat resume supervision. And let two halves of whatever you meant to do find each other by morning with the simple relief of fibers reunited, and the room, at last, counting nothing. You might not expect a slow beeping noise to carry a whole rumor on its back, but radio waves are patient travelers and gossip sleeps lightly in the ionosphere. Picture midnight static, the kind that sounds like soft rain falling on tin, and under it a measured pulse, not hurried, not heroic, simply there. Somewhere in Turin in the early 1960s, two brothers are awake when most people are being sensible. Their equipment is partly homemade, partly repurposed, and entirely confident. Coils gleam like tidy noodles, a tape recorder blinks with the optimism of fresh capacitors, and an ashtray studies the situation. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers have tuned their ears to the Vostok band because that is where the sky carries its messages these days. They listen for beeps, for the easy rise and fall of Doppler as an object moves overhead, for the tiny fuss that means a valve is warm and speaking. On one tape, a human breath appears where no human breath should be, a thin strand of warmth across an otherwise mechanical landscape. On another, a voice counts down in clipped Russian and then withdraws into the still of the cosmos. If you re still awake when we reach the bit about what static can and can, due to a vowel, feel free to subscribe or simply let your eyelids agree with gravity. Either option supports independent sleep research. The brothers keep labels. The labels are calm, as all good labels strive to be. Frequencies, times, dates, a note about cloud cover because clouds have opinions about radio. They stack their reels according to a logic that would impress librarians and cats. In one reel, a woman whispers that it is hot. In another, there is a heartbeat that seems a little too human for circuitry. Later, listeners will position these sounds on charts and then argue gently over them like scholars, deciding whether a medieval scribe sneezed on folio 57. The brothers don't rush to conclusions. The sky, while generous with sound, is stingy with context. They know that telemetry can be Morse with a diploma. They also know that short waves bounce from the ionosphere like tourists who forgot their passports. Reflections take dramatic routes, and echoes can impersonate heroes. The brothers log, rewind, listen again, and then label the shelf. Possible, maybe keep. It is the sort of filing system that keeps the world from getting carried away. Beyond Turin, other ears are awake. Amateur operators from Britain to Japan draw faint tracks on paper as satellites pass, like tracing the shadow of a slow moth. When you point a small aerial politely at the sky, it will occasionally point back in the form of data too thin to disturb an insomniac. Some of these tracks look like low orbits. Some are mirror tricks off the ionosphere, traveling sound that fancies itself an astronaut. Debris re-entries sing briefly and then retire. High-altitude tests throw echoes like parties throw confetti. Intelligence satellites practice their own sort of shyness, complicated by euphemisms. The sky offers data, the ground offers interpretations, and between them floats a quiet understanding that stories will be selected for their ability to fit, like furniture through a narrow door. In pencil, someone writes phantom orbit because the phrase is both useful and amused with itself. You can sleep soundly knowing that even in espionage, people still reach for poetry when a graph runs out of adjectives. If we were to walk into an archive not at night, because archivists prefer daylight, that near closing, when paper is most relaxed, we define that what is missing sometimes speaks louder than what is filed. Soviet newspapers praise outstanding parachutists, a phrase that manages to be both specific and extremely nonspecific. Later copies omit the mention. Group photographs of cosmonaut trainees gradually narrow as faces are cropped. Spaces shift, captions grow discreet. No one says why the chairs need more elbow room. Personnel lists show promising trainees dropped for health reasons, which is the sort of diagnosis that suits many symptoms, including stubbornness and good sense. On a launch manifest, a vehicle number appears without a flight. In a ledger, a test pad is listed as untouched, while eyewitnesses remember a busy week. A film reel shows a scorch on Monday that is repaired by Thursday. The camera does not offer commentary. Folders hold papers with black rectangles that lie like calm pillows over dates and call signs. The material inhales and exhales like a sleeping thing, and we are invited to draw conclusions in the spaces between. In a government building, drawers have a way of not opening all the way. Inside there are cards with strings that look like polite tales. Classified is printed in a typeface that never gets too excited. A memo says reschedule, and the rescheduling happens, but the memo doesn't say what needed to breathe. In one box, a small stack of reception reports from foreign listening posts interferes with the neatness. They are inconveniently certain about a thing that later memories would prefer to forget. The box is put aside to be handled later by someone patient with contradictions. Archives keep some air for themselves. If you have ever kept a drawer that doesn't tee quite close, because the things inside seem happiest like that, you understand state secrets at a human scale. Institutions call it retention. Ordinary people call it, I'll deal with it in the morning. Meanwhile, rockets do practical things in indifferent air. Before the smiling photographs and the tidy speeches, engineers send mannequins with respectable first names into the sky to see whether straps behave and whether parachutes prefer to open on time. Dogs, who possess credentials in optimism, ride to the edge of space and map brute facts no mathematics can fully domesticate. Heat, vibration, boredom, the kind of loneliness that is less about feelings and more about the quantity of horizon. The edge of engineering has a different weather from the middle. Outside the middle, there is less bureaucracy and more velocity, and the only politics is whether a bolt should be 10 millimeters longer. A pad can change from night to day in a single flash if a valve decides to interpret its job creatively. When Netherlands catastrophe erupted across a steppe in 1960, it explained to everyone in the harshest possible classroom how quickly a schedule can turn to ash. Doctors recommend caution, Korolev recommends speed, the party recommends victory. The machinery recommends reading the manual, and in that tangle the risk sits calmly, a teacher who knows there will be a test whether you study or not. A perfect orbit is a round, tidy promise. A nearly perfect orbit is a question in search of a meeting. Around major flights, there will always be stories that once had edges and now have cushions. Test of high altitude research equipment, says a report that shows scorches on its paperwork. Telemetry recovered with anomalies, says another, meaning someone somewhere heard something they would rather not debate at a press conference. States hoard telemetry the way navies hoard codebooks. When rivals listen closely, everyone speaks softly. A death that happens at a test site is buried at a test site. A launch reclassified as a research event asks newspapers to yawn and move along. Monuments speak softly. Eulogies speak even softer. If the phrase announced, delayed, or erased sounds like a bureaucratic menu, that is because bureaucracies run on menus. It is the only way to feed that many decisions. So the rumors settle like fine snow, a woman's breath on a tape, a countdown that doesn't count up again, a report of a radio beacon whose Doppler curve suggests an object falling or an echo distorting someone else's object, a call sign that appears once and never again, a capsule said to have re-entered without a headline, a hospital that receives a visitor at an odd hour and keeps his name as softly as breath, stories of practice missions that were not quite practice. These are the micro hooks that keep historians awake just slightly longer than they planned. They are also the sorts of crumbs that sprout legends, and legends like sourdough are hard to stop once they learn what a warm room is for. If you've ever looked at a sock with a hole and decided to wear it anyway because the rest of the sock was doing its best, you have the appropriate level of indulgence for early space programs. And yet scientists, who are professional skeptics with excellent manners, come with their rulers. They measure spectrum lines. They weigh the Doppler shift the way one weighs an apple at a market scale, making allowances for bruises and gravity in the seller's friendly eye. A recording made in Turin is compared with one made in Texas and another in Tokyo. If the curves dance together across the paper, the room gets interested. If they step on each other's feet, we call it atmospheric skip and make tea. Sound that has traveled through too many reflections compresses itself like luggage under a bed. Filters mistuned by a few kilohertz introduce ghosts, which are quieter than actual ghosts, but much more common. A plaintive voice can be an artifact of cheap tape stretched by curiosity. A heartbeat can be the interference pattern of two machines who never met. You can almost hear the equations laying down napkins, positioning forks. If signal equals S and noise equals N, we would like a large S and a small n, please, but the kitchen is what it is. The Earth, unhelpfully spherical, complicates all this. A satellite low and fast sings one song when it rises and another when it sets. The curvature edits everything. A listener hears the pitch slide up and then down, like a child on a playground that forgot to be dramatic. When two listeners very far apart compare notes, the timing of those slides tells whether the sound was in space or merely liked to pretend. Sometimes the slides agree politely. Sometimes one recording is a bit late to the party and the other is early, and the only thing to do is chalk it up to weather and move on. Engineers point at the sky and say ionospheric conditions, which is science's way of admitting that the heavens have moods. What then of the woman who said it was hot? What of the slow telemeter beeping its own lonely metronome? Caution recommends we stack explanations like blankets until the cold cannot crash the conversation. Perhaps she was a test subject on a terrestrial rig, one of the many brave bodies acclimating machines to people rather than the other way around. Perhaps the tape recorder added a human shape to a mechanical whine because its heads needed cleaning. Perhaps the telemetry was nothing more exotic than a known satellite, its identity smudged by a reflection. Or perhaps, and this is the door that never quite closes, there was a mission we don't have paperwork for, and the sky carried a voice that never found its headline. History is a ledger with lines for both ink and erasers. It tolerates what cannot be proven with the same polite patience it offers to what can. If there was one signal that was true, it would be the most ordinary, extraordinary thing. A nameless person crossing night alone, the hull warm at first and then cooling, the whole world below rolling like a marble too large to pocket. The radio would be a friend with inconsistent manners, sometimes clear, sometimes rude. Training would come back as muscle memory humming to itself. The control room, wherever it was, would answer in professional calm, a tone that helps the heart believe what math suggests. If such a flight happened without fanfare, the reasons for quiet would be simple. Technical risk, political calendar, the universal human preference for good news and tidy packaging. Success likes trumpet fanfares, failure prefers euphemisms, ambiguity chooses the night shift. A name without a public face would be owed a plaque and a practical silence, a common historical compromise. You do not have to decide from your pillow. The legend of the lost cosmonauts lives comfortably in the half-light where bedtime stories do their best work. A genuine attic, a pair of careful brothers, reels of tape labeled with neat hands, a stack of censored pages that breathe through their black rectangles, engineers counting bolts and dogs counting minutes, euphemisms marching with tidy shoes, scientists weighing spectrum lines and inviting disagreeable facts to dinner. Somewhere in the mix, perhaps a single human breath where none should be, or perhaps a dozen little accidents making a convincing impersonation. Every few years, the story wakes up, straightens its collar, and asks the same question in the same quiet voice. Who was out there first heard but never announced? If you're still awake, take comfort in the unglamorous machinery of understanding. Every rumor, even the gentle ones, is tested against a curve, a clock, a comparison. People who like certainty get sleep eventually. People who prefer mystery get excellent hobbies. The brothers in Turin would recommend a good label and a steady gain knob. The archives would recommend patience with drawers that resist. The engineers would recommend reading the manual twice. The scientists would recommend checking the Earth's curve before declaring anything heroic. And the night, which minds its own ancient business, offers static that sounds like soft rain and the promise that any signal worth chasing will be waiting tomorrow, exactly where orbital mechanics left it. Let the telemeter tick calmly at the edge of your thoughts. Let the stars be mostly geometry and the rest rumor. Let your breath do what the tape once did, go in, go out, repeat, and allow the snow of the cosmos to settle into a silence that does not ask you to decide, only to rest. You might not expect a painted wooden sphere to decide when an entire harbor should look at its watch, but for a while, that was the most reliable thing the sea knew. Imagine a ball, usually black, sometimes red, perched like a patient fruit at the top of a mast above an observatory roof. Every day, near noon, the ball slid up its pole with dignified purpose and paused, as if remembering something important. Then, at the agreed moment, it dropped. Gravity signed the time with a thud that no one heard, because the sound was the sight. This was the time ball, a device so polite it told you the truth without raising its voice. If you stay awake long enough for me to mention how many coats of paint were recommended for marine climates, 3, thin, applied on a dry day, you're welcome to subscribe. Or close your eyes and imagine varnish drying. Both choices are excellent for rest. Harbors learn to watch the sky for falling time. At Greenwich, the first famous ball began dropping in 1833, just after 1 o'clock, because astronomers like to check the sun properly, and the sun liked to take its time being checked. Ships anchored on the Thames stared up from bobbing decks. and officers raised eyebrows at chronometers as if coaxing them into accuracy. The ritual spread because sailors are conservative about two things: hulls and minutes. Portsmouth had a ball. Liverpool, Sydney, Halifax, Cape Town, anywhere with ships that wished to leave and also to arrive. You set your chronometer when the ball began to fall, not when it hit the bottom, which is one of those practical details that makes a world both safer and slightly more amusing. A captain would stand ready with key and calm face, and when the ball let go, he nudged his timepiece toward certainty. An entire voyage could be within a mile or two of itself because a carpentered sphere obeyed gravity at the same second each day. The choreography was simple, and therefore robust. In late morning, a mechanism hauled the ball to its halfway rest. A few minutes before the hour, it was hoisted to the top, where it hung like a punctuation mark, wondering whether it would be a period or an exclamation point. At precisely the agreed time 1 p.m. in Greenwich's case, a clerk released the catch. The ball dropped in a measured sigh toward the deckhouse roof, where a little fence kept it from wandering. This was not drama. It was confidence made visible. Men who had learned to shout over wind fell into silence for a handful of seconds. The sea continued being itself. Gulls continued delivering commentary. But in hundreds of eyes, a tiny calculation took place. Now, set, note the error, breathe. The whole thing needed weather more than applause. Fog could cancel in the way a teacher cancels recess. A rain squall turned the ball into a rumor. In Sydney, on clear days, people as far as Parramatta claimed to see it fall. On murky ones, even the observatory garden pretended it hadn't. At Cape Town, the original ball misbehaved in strong southeasters, which is what a ball does when it believes in freedom. The solution was not to scold, but to guide. Better rails, a modified winch, an extra dab of grease. A note in an observatory log might say, ball jammed momentarily on descent. Chronometers allowed for it, which is one of the gentlest lines of scientific literature. The device's strength was not perfection, but transparency. It was wrong openly and could be forgiven, because time at sea, before all this, was a creature of shadows. Ships carried sundials for amusement and hourglasses for procedure. Noon happened when the sun was highest subject to cloud, enthusiasm, and the ship's own swagger. Noon also happened when the master said it did. Latitude could be charmed out of the sun with a sextant and a little trigonometry. Longitude, before a reliable clock, was a matter of personal spirituality. The Board of Longitude, which was really a meeting with paper hats, dangled prizes. John Harrison built clocks that could be carried by a ship without bursting into tears. By the 19th century, a ship could bring its own noon from home and compare it with local noon wherever waves allowed. The difference between the two was longitude, like a polite disagreement that produces a map. Time balls, therefore, were less invention than invitation. They invited ships to agree together, to promise each other in ballast and brass that they would be somewhere on purpose. They also invited townspeople to stand at windows at exactly the same moment, an early daily experience of synchronized society. The growth of railways made this sort of agreement urgently boring. A train schedule prefers clocks that do not improvise. Station masters like to look official. Passengers like to arrive before their puddings cooled. Time balls linked the local noon to the astronomer's noon, and the astronomer's noon to the telegraph wire, and the wire to everywhere that could hum. The 19th century learned, gently, that time can be mailed. Asterisk telegraphy gave the ball its second wind. Before wires, the Greenwich ball was set by the telescope alone, very respectable, but meteorologically picky. With a wire to the Admiralty and onward to observatories and signal stations, the drop at 1 o'clock could be coordinated with an electric twitch from somewhere miles away. In Liverpool, for a while, a signal from the port office used a pneumatic tube that whistled with intent. In Halifax, the ball on Citadel Hill took its cue from a cable that shrugged off the Atlantic. A time ball at Deal was reported to have been struck by lightning, which it found instructive. People learned to trust the wire even when they could not see the stars. The whole network looked like something a child would draw if asked to picture a polite conspiracy, dots connected by lines, with a ball sitting like a polite period at each node, dropping on cue. Sailors wrote down their rate, the lovely word for how a chronometer strays per day from virtue. A good rate was small and predictable, like a librarian's cough. Officers kept tables with corrections and fractions of seconds, bending the day to match the clock and the clock to respect the day. A chronometer's personality was discussed the way one discusses mules. This one warms to the tropics. That one dislikes shock. The third has opinions about the Azores. A ship with 2 chronometers felt wealthy. A ship with 3 felt philosophical. If 2 disagreed, the third might be asked to mediate. If all 3 disagreed, the captain invoked character, a resource unevenly distributed dot here and there, the paper trail lifts an eyebrow. A note from 1861 complains that the public are disposed to clap when the ball falls, which apparently offended the dignity of meridian time. Another from 1878 describes a boy who tried to climb the pole and was dissuaded by a gardener with a rake timekeeping as horticulture. At Newcastle, the job of raising the ball fell to a man who also tended roses, the sort of cross-training that never appears in textbooks but keeps civilizations intact. In New York, a competing time ball tried to claim authority before the observatory was ready. Someone explained that gravity should take instructions, not suggestions. The tone is always gentle. The thing about daily rituals is that they teach patience as part of the content. Mistakes arrived like weather, briefly and with stories attached. Once, a gale dragged the ball into its safety hoop before the catch was released. For half the harbor, it looked as if time had fallen early. An observatory posted a placard explaining that noon has not yet occurred, a sentence that deserves more fame than it has. Another time the telegraph failed, but the crowd gathered anyway, including a small dog who believed the ball was for him. The staff waited, then raised a flag with dignified apology. People set their pocket watches to the flag because humans love ceremony. The dog set his heart to the flag because dogs love flags. In most cases, a printed notice the next day adjusted everything back by a second or two, and the sea forgave the difference. Meanwhile, the world grew wires the way trees grow twigs. At first, the wire carried a daily time signal, then every hour, then every minute. In cities, factory whistles learned to hoot at 12 by a drop attended by no one but mechanics. The famous ball drop on New Year's Eve in New York, which began in 1907, borrowed its poise from maritime timekeeping and added confetti for urban digestion. Modern towers learned to flash time and light because light travels politely where fog is not invited. Still, the wooden ball continued to fall in dozens of ports because ships trust what they can see. The telegraph told the ball when. The ball told the harbor told the sea. The sea told nobody because the sea keeps its own counsel. Underneath all of it, astronomy kept breathing steadily. Astronomers stared at a slit of sky and allowed the world to rotate past like a page through a printing press. Stars crossed threads in an eyepiece, sometimes silk, sometimes spider, and a chronograph pen ticked a set black line each time one slid across its assigned crossing. The errors had personalities. Clock drift. Personal equation, the lovely name for the time it takes a particular observer to press a key after seeing a star, ranging from brisk to contemplative. Atmospheric refraction. If you want to sleep quickly, think about the personal equation. Responsible human delay formalized into a constant, as if the universe were very understanding about reflexes. Those star transits yielded the day's corrections, and those corrections traveled down wires to the balls, and the balls fell as if their decisions began in the Pleiades. When radios learned to mutter the hour, the balls began to retire. Radio time signals, first in Morse, then in shiny tones, reached ships at sea without asking them to squint back toward land. Quartz clocks arrived with excellent posture. War taught everyone to black out skylines, which forced even the most devoted ball to consider a sabbatical. By mid-century, many towers had given up their daily drop, and the remaining balls visited only for tourists, like retired sea captains who shake hands at ceremonies and expertly avoid ladders. Yet a few continued. At Portsmouth, the ball kept falling into the 1920s because tradition is a sailor's favorite proof. At Lyttelton in New Zealand, the ball dropped daily until the 1930s. At Wellington, it continued until the 1930 earthquake damaged the mechanism, which is how geology participates in TIMEKEEPING. My favorite footnote is a group of inland towns that wanted time balls despite having no ships, because accuracy is contagious. In one little town, the ball instructed shift whistles and school bells, and the public learned the pleasure of being correct together. Saying "see you at 1" in a town with a ball felt less hopeful. If you listen closely, you can hear the 19th century clearing its throat, taking up the habit we now accept without comment, that strangers can meet at a specified moment without the assistance of the sun. The time ball looks silly only until you remember. This taught people how to share seconds. There were also failures of ambition that soothed the heart. A ball designed to drop 3 times a day promised more than the staff could provide, and after a month returned to once. A polite notice cited practical considerations without explaining which considerations were the least athletic. Another ball attempted to use a falling bucket of sand to damp the descent, and instead produced a daily puff and a clouded lens. The garden complained, and the idea quietly retired. In Stockholm, spring frost locked the guide rails, and the keeper kept a calendar of which days would never be perfectly known. The margin of error printed later was several seconds, which is a phrase that begs for a blanket and some tea, even in their decline. The balls taught something steady, that the world appreciates repeated kindness. Every day at the same moment, a simple mechanism offered a gift to anyone who cared to look. No password, no fee, no certificate. The bridge officer on a tramp steamer, the clerk at a dockside warehouse, the child counting along with a parent's quiet voice, all could participate in being correct. We do this now with phones that blink due to satellites arguing above us. It is faster and extremely efficient and very good. But it is not visible in the way a ball is visible. It does not ask the sky to be clear or the clock to be honest where everyone can see it. It does not gather people at windows at the same instant to share a second of agreed-upon silence before the street resumes. Today, a few time balls still fall. At Deal, a recreated ball drops for ceremony. At Hull, an old one sits with the patience of retired furniture. At Greenwich, the original still falls at 1, a continued courtesy to the Thames and to anyone who enjoys ritual. On New Year's Eve, a luminous descendant claims all the attention, noisier, taller, flashier, counting down a year for a crowd that likes its seconds to be loud. The family resemblance is there, the pause at the top, the communal breath, the release. If you watch closely, you can see the older wisdom inside the glitter. When the ball begins to move, everyone agrees, just for a moment. About the world, it can be oddly calming to think about the last person who wound a particular mechanism and locked the little door behind the ladder. They knew where each grease cup was, which bolt liked an extra quarter turn, and how the rope felt on cold days versus hot. They knew the sound of a good drop, the soft, brief rush that says both gravity and carpentry are on speaking terms. They knew the audience, who looked up with faces all pointed in the same direction and eyes all thinking the same thought, which was not lofty philosophy, but something practical and precise. They knew the feeling of checking a watch, making a tiny adjustment, and arriving home later a little less lost. You can imagine them standing for a moment after the crowd has drifted, listening to the clock tick and the wind gossip around the pole. Content that today's noon has taken place, and tomorrow's noon will cue politely. When you let your mind drift, the whole apparatus turns into a bedtime instrument. The ball rises halfway. Pause. It rises to the top. Pause. The catch waits. You count down quietly with the unseen clerk, using numbers that have no urgency. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, release. The ball drops in a clean line, as if to say that some things we let go of on purpose. 100 small corrections take place below, a ship's time nudged a whisper, a clerk's pencil tapping the margin of a ledger, a pair of children agreeing that the day can proceed. Then everything resets for tomorrow, which is the time ball's best joke. It falls forever and nothing falls apart. If you're still listening, consider that accuracy does not always need excitement. Sometimes it has painted wood, a winch with grease on its conscience, an astronomer with spider silk threads in a brass tube, and a crowd who understand that being together can be as simple as looking up at the same moment. Consider how many voyages ended correctly because of a brief daily gesture. Consider how many lunches began. If sleep wants a picture, give it a quiet harbor, a mast with a small fence around a square of roof, gulls astonished by nothing, and a ball waiting at the top for the world to agree. Then let it fall, and let your thoughts fall with it, not crashing but settling, as if gravity were a friend with perfect timing, and the day, finally, has all the seconds it needs. You might not expect a hiss of shortwave static to sound like a museum label, but it does. Especially late at night when the house is quiet and the walls have an excellent memory for echoes. Imagine a dial moving slowly through the Vostok band, the needle sliding past numbers like a careful librarian, and somewhere between two beeps, a human breath hides itself among the chirps. The first thing you notice is how patient the noise is. The second thing is how very unhurried a mystery can be when it wears headphones. If you're still awake when I reach the part about atmospheric skip and the polite work ethic of the ionosphere, you can subscribe or just decide mentally that you would have if gravity had not already taken your eyelids. Both actions register the same in the great ledger of Sleep Dot in the attic of a polite building in Turin. Two brothers, Giacomo and Achille Giudica Cordiglia, tuned homemade receivers in the early 1960s, where the night was less dark and more technical. They listened to VHF and UHF bands that Soviet spacecraft liked to visit, and they took notes with the kind of quiet confidence that belongs to amateurs who have read the manuals and improved them in pencil. Their equipment was assembled from enthusiasm, scavenged parts, and that most dependable component, patience. The brothers' log Doppler shifts the way birders' log song, measuring each rising and falling curve until the past drew itself as a tidy hill on squared paper. Somewhere on those hills, according to the brothers, live a heartbeat, a weak voice, and a complaint about heat, spoken in a Russian that sounds closer to a whisper than a language. These recordings have been argued over for 60 years, which is a reasonable lifespan for an argument that never needed to win. Shortwave has the manners of a hallway. Voices travel, but mostly as rumors of themselves. A beep is safer. The beeps of early spacecraft behaved like polite guests, announcing position without oversharing. The brothers claimed to hear numbers that could be time, and breathing that could be human, and once, the awful phrase that something had grown hot. Labels on the tapes are neat, which is a comfort. Dates are careful, which is another way of saying they may not be exact. The attic smells of solder, dust, and the faintly optimistic scent of ambitions that can be carried upstairs. No one knows for certain what the brothers heard. Everyone knows that they wanted to hear it. The recordings make fine bedtime companions because they do not insist. They only offer a series of hints bundled into a spool, across Europe and across oceans. Ham operators with better antennas and very similar personalities trace curves in the night sky. The most ambitious built interferometers out of fence posts. Others simply aimed at where the newspapers said the orbit should be and waited. Orbits appeared, strengthened, and slid away again, like sentences in a dream. Sometimes a reflection off the ionosphere mimicked a dying battery. Sometimes debris fell through the radio spectrum like a handful of screws. Sometimes an actual re-entry rasped its way across the frequency, turning plasma noise into a rude cousin of applause. A few times, or so the stories go, a weak voice traveled under it all like a note pinned to a coat. The sky offers data, and interpretation chooses the story. The choice can be careful and still be a choice dot in Moscow. Paperwork practiced a different kind of silence. The Soviet space program spoke when success required it, and otherwise preferred to clear its throat. Personnel lists praised outstanding parachutists, then quietly stopped printing their medals. Cosmonaut group photos have their own choreography. Rows tighten, captions grow careful, a shoulder disappears behind an elbow. Training manifests lists candidates withdrawn for health reasons, in a handwriting that somehow looks official even when typed. It is ordinary bureaucracy, and it is also theater. A name might appear in 3 documents and then nowhere, like a star that visited the catalog only long enough to be misprinted. A Western researcher could be forgiven for thinking the gaps formed a constellation. They might also form nothing at all. Absence, as many archivists will tell you while labeling folders, is a productive thing. Film reels offer their own almosts. In a can that once held peaches, a short sequence shows a charred pad on Monday and a rebuilt pad by Thursday, which suggests either a magnificent workforce or an editor who is keen on brevity. Test numbers blink in chalk on the side of rocket stages like modest signatures. A series of dogs wear expressions ranging from heroic to skeptical, because dogs are the proper audience for human ambitions. In declassified folders, black rectangles cover dates and call signs with the delicacy of a censor who also appreciates graphic design. It would be rude to pretend this is unusual. Every space program has moments it prefers to keep indoors. The difference is mostly that one side's indoor voice carried farther, asterisk before any celebrity could strap in and wave. Mannequins rode the early flights. They had names because engineers are sentimental and because it helps in paperwork if a doll is a person. Even Ivanovich, the John Doe of the atmosphere, went first, with sensors placed where a nervous imagination would put them. Dogs map survival limits with the same patience they bring to naps. A pad can flash to daylight with one wrong wire, as a general named Nedelin learned at Baikonur, where haste conducted its own demonstration. The lesson was meticulous. Space hardware does not forgive enthusiasm. If something breaks in vacuum, there is no appeal, and so on Earth engineers become boring. That noble adjective, the way surgeons become repetitive. In the margins of test logs, you can see caution make pencil marks. Sometimes the politics is practical. A perfect orbit deserves fanfare. A partial one invites questions. A descent that lands a capsule in a place not on the map invites a committee. States hoard telemetry the way navies hoard codebooks. When rivals listen, modesty becomes strategy. Announcements are delayed or rephrased to demonstrate that everything happened on purpose and also at a convenient time. An accident on Tuesday can be reclassified as high-altitude research by Saturday, which is not as sinister as it sounds if you have ever had to write an office email that says good news and explains a different event. Euphemisms are the velvet rope between embarrassment and history. But the world has a habit of measuring what it cares about. In snowy countries, the receiving dishes look like clean bowls turned up to catch data and weather at once. Spectrum lines are weighed. Doppler sweeps are measured against Earth's curve. Students compare a suspicious recording against known satellites, then against nothing at all, which can align more precisely than you'd expect. Voice compression leaves traces the way a sponge leaves marks on a countertop. Atmospheric skip handles vowels with a heavy hand. Mistuned filters create ghosts that are, in their way, charming. The result of all this diligent checking is rarely a trumpet. More often, it's a sentence you could embroider on a pillow, fragments of clarity, stitched by caution. The most sleep-friendly fact is that multiple explanations can be correct enough. A breathing sound could be a human under stress. It could be a cosmonaut reading numbers through a mask. It could be the telemetry equivalent of wind in a pipe. A rising tone might be a capsule climbing. It might be the Doppler effect from a nearby satellite with unremarkable intentions. It might be a recorder's capstan having a personal day. A weak voice saying it is hot can be a plea, or a calibration test, or a phenomenon called selective hearing performed by the heart. Professionals will tell you so softly while putting another sheet of graph paper into the machine. Most ghosts vanish under good lighting. Some just decide to be quiet. When you follow the paperwork, you meet interesting people whose job is to be exact. One writes apparent anomaly likely human factors, which means the observer was sleepy. Another writes nominal within limit, which means the hardware behaved and we are relieved. A third, older than the rest, writes, "See also correspondence of 1962, which means please read before re-asking the question I answered 20 years ago." These notes are small acts of housekeeping. The drawers where they live are more important than the rumors they sift. History is often your most conscientious clerk putting a rubber stamp where the story wants fireworks. Still, small facts poke through like grass. An unannounced flight in 1961 lines up suspiciously with an odd outage on a line from Baikonur. A photographer's contact sheet shows a pressure suit that does not appear in any parade. Somewhere in a provincial newspaper, the obituary of a test pilot mentions a training accident at altitude with the comfort of euphemism. A Western intelligence summary prefers the phrase, possible crude test, a masterwork of indecision. Put them together, and you have a tidy collage that resists becoming a picture. You can keep it on the mantle and point to it fondly when visitors ask about mysteries. You can also leave it in the drawer and sleep perfectly well. The reasons for silence, if there were early crewed flights that ended poorly, are not purely theatrical. They are bureaucratic, practical, and sometimes protective. Hard-won secrets do not like company. Public mourning competes with momentum. The party had a schedule with adjectives. Engineers wanted another test stand and a little more time with the valves. Doctors wanted to recheck G limits. Cosmonauts wanted to fly and also to come home for tea. None of this makes a conspiracy. It makes a workplace. If you have ever watched a room full of serious people argue about whether Tuesday or Thursday is better for a presentation, you will recognize the tempo of the archive stop. We circle back to the brothers in Turin because they are tidy. Bookends for this kind of history. They could not know what they did not know, but they knew enough to log carefully. Their charts have the reassuring neatness of a school exercise. They underlined in red pencil where the curves seemed too human. They filed spools by date and then by season, as if winter recordings were slightly more honest. Later analysis points out inconsistencies, unlikely timing, the occasional contradiction. The attic remains a good place to think about space. It doesn't require resolution. It only requires a chair, a coiled cable, and an ear that appreciates the difference between certainty and its neighbors. The physics that holds this all together is pleasantly boring. A transmitter on a spacecraft emits at a known frequency. As the craft approaches, the tone rises. As it recedes, the tone falls. If you plot the shift against time, the curve reveals the speed and therefore, with a little math, the height. Double that with passes on different headings and you can outline a path. Amateur trackers did this with pencil and protractors. Professionals did it with machines that use more power than a small town. Both groups wrote the same numbers, give or take. If you want to drift into sleep, picture a line slowly sloping up, cresting, and sliding down, over and over, until the page is full and the room is quiet. In the snow, a dish acquires a hat. Students in parkas sweep the feed horn with brooms, which counts as both science and janitorial arts. A voice emerges briefly, thinner than the cold air around it. It is counted, measured, tagged with a time that is either local or universal depending on who wrote the label. This is what checking looks like, not a revelation, but a notebook. Somewhere, a senior engineer leaves a thermos near the heater and reminds the junior that tape machines prefer warmth and patience, both of which are also useful for people. The data returns to town, where a graduate student notices that the timing of one pass is exactly the length of a good sandwich. And everyone nods out occasionally. A claim wanders through the literature and asks for applause. The first woman in space before the first woman in space. The first loss before the first official paragraph allowed one. These are hard to sit with, not because they are impossible, but because they carry the specific gravity of regret. Scientists do what scientists do. They compare the voice formants with known samples and shrug. They map the time zone that the words suggest when someone says it's hot, and shrug again because the ionosphere mispronounces vowels. They test whether the Doppler shift matches an Earth-orbiting object, or a ham in a car going around a roundabout for fun, and perhaps they smile briefly before returning to the sandwich length pass that did happen and therefore can be written down without adjectives. Science in the snow is a fine lullaby. It implies that people in sturdy boots and excellent hats are keeping the world honest while you sleep. A spectrogram looks like a calm winter field lines like fence posts, a few tracks, the sky in grayscale. A good night is when nothing needs to be explained in a hurry. A great night is when something odd appears and the explanation waits politely until morning. This is not the dramatic cinema of lost missions. It is the paperwork of knowing where your planet is and how fast things fall around it. It is quite enough. The last question, whispered as a courtesy, is the softest. What if one signal was true? What if before the official first, someone crossed night alone and the hole grew thin with heat, and the beeps that were supposed to be happy were not? History would owe that person a nameplate, and the sky would owe them nothing, because the sky rarely borrows. We are left with tapes that cannot testify, and curves that invite interpretation, and a stack of memos that do not mention Thursday. We have, too, the fact that early spaceflight was risky in ways that now sound like folklore. Plenty of men and women have ridden rockets into moments with no good synonyms. Some are famous. Some are footnotes. Some are rumors that will never apply for promotion. Either way, the beeps remain restful. They drift like frost past your headphones, regular, then slightly irregular, then regular again. The same way breath goes when someone is almost asleep in the next room. The attic in Turin goes dark except for the pilot light and a small red bulb that indicates a recording ready to be believed by whoever needs belief. Far away, a snowy dish waits for the next pass. A file cabinet in a quiet building holds names that were once proposed for space and then proposed for something else. The world keeps time the way it always has, with more clocks than stories and more stories than conclusions. If a voice did cross the night first and was never announced, then somewhere a line in a notebook has already, very gently, made room for it. You can close your eyes on that, which is as far as this particular orbit needs to go. You might not expect a heap of ground eggshells to keep a fleet on schedule, but for a few quiet centuries, it did. The tool was simple enough to explain to a sleepy child. Sand goes down. The crew turns the glass, the bell says thank you, and the ship keeps moving. That is the whole plot, and it repeats until land appears or the story runs out of wind. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe or promise in your heart that you meant to. I will never know. The glass won't either. It only counts what falls. A ship's hourglass was not actually filled with sand, not if the quartermaster cared about his reputation. Sand clumps. Sailors don't like clumps. The preferred mixture was a polite blend of ground marble crushed, eggshell, and sometimes a pinch of lead or tin filings that made the pour smooth, the way sifted flour behaves better in a cake. Some workshops wrote recipes on paper that smelled of tallow and pride. They baked the mix in low ovens to dry it, then waited, then sighed, then baked it again, because the sea has very definite feelings about humidity. The bulbs of the glass were blown in pairs, joined at the neck by a narrow waist as fussy as a violin bridge. A leather washer sat between the bulbs, not for romance but to prevent seepage, because it was hard to sell a timer that slowly salted the captain's desk. Pitch sealed the seam. The result did not tick, it whispered. Sailors liked quiet tools. The glass fit in the hand like a simple promise. It had no mainspring to break and no balance wheel to sulk, only grains that agreed to fall one by one in public. Many ships carried a family of them, a glass for a half hour, a glass for 4, a glass for a day when the sun refused to cooperate with noon. Columbus sailed with a basketful. Magellan's Victoria had a pile of them big enough to earn inventory numbers. One seaman, the turner of the glass, kept a stubborn eye on the neck. Every 30 minutes he turned it. It was a modest throne, this job. The penalty for forgetting could be a very slow, very boring lecture about discipline that ended with everyone looking at the bell. The bell was the glass's voice. 1 ring after the first turn, 2 rings after the second, up to 8, which meant 4 hours of the watch had gone by. Then the count reset because the sea, like a cat, prefers cycles to conclusions. There were 6 watches in a day, except for the dog watches, 2 short half watches in the evening. That chopped the schedule into uneven pieces so no one drew the same hours forever and was strange. A glass measured those half watches the way a careful baker measures half an egg. On a still night, the bell made a soft cone of sound that drifted into the rigging and came back with a little rope on it. Sailors learn the rhythm the way a city kid learns the bus. 1 bell, nobody fusses. 4 bells, think about tea. 8 bells, change places with the person whose face looks most relieved. Not all falling is equal. The glass had to be mounted in gimbals or placed in a wooden frame, with cheeks so the ship's roll didn't give the grains a slope to argue with. Even so, a hurricane could tilt time. The turner developed a wrist that knew when the neck was sulking. He flicked the glass gently, the way a librarian nudges a book back into place. He tapped the frame with the pad of 2 fingers, which added no seconds to the day, but made him feel like a conspirator with gravity. In dry air, the mix ran fast. In damp air, it took a thoughtful pause. Quartermasters kept a candle near the glass to warm the waist, because a little heat makes grains behave. The ship's cat, if it existed, learned to sleep under that shelf. It enjoyed the microclimate and did not care about longitude. Calibration was slow, the way trustworthy things are. In port, a mate compared the 4-hour glass against a shore clock that might have been wound by a man whose main qualification was good posture. At sea, the sun did the honors. If the captain called noon when the sun said so, and the glass said something else, the glass was wrong. Or perhaps the captain was wrong. Sailors pretended not to notice that option. They scraped a little from the belly of a fast glass, or added a pinch to a slow one, and tried again tomorrow. A good glass was like a good temper, reliable but not bragging. It aged with the ship. When the crew learned its habit of gaining a breath on cool mornings, they simply remembered to be kind to it. There is a superbly boring logbook note from a Dutch ship that says, "Our half-hour glass runs swift in fog." It is the sort of sentence that helped empires move. The glass did not sail alone, of course. It had a friend, the log line, which resembled a thin idea attached to a bit of wood. Every watch, or every other watch, depending on how bossy your bosun was, the crew tossed the log over the stern and let the line pay out for a set number of seconds, measured by the sand in a special short glass, while knots tied in the line slid through a sailor's fingers like beads on an abacus. The number of knots let go, while the grains fell, told the speed. Then a hand made the small arithmetic of distance, speed times hours, all politely divided into portions of a day like a pie that had agreed to geometry. If the half-hour glass cheated by a sliver, the result was not a disaster. It simply nudged the ship's imagined position a little left or right on a chart made of confidence. Shipboard time had very little to do with the time on land. On land, a town declared noon when its shadow, on its own church, felt ready. At sea, noon happened whenever the captain's eye and sextant agreed it had. If the glass suggested the watch was half done when the sun insisted it was not, the sun usually won. But every decision went into the log, the book that slept in the captain's cabin and woke 5 times a day to drink ink. There you find entries like glass turned irregularly during squall, bell rung to standard, which translates to we did what sounded right. You also find dog watch divided as custom, a phrase so soothing that you can almost hear the rope creak contentedly. In that tone, the world is navigated. The Admiralty encouraged uniformity, as bureaucracies do when they discover that identical tools make identical paperwork. Certain workshops gain reputations. A glass from Barnstaple might be praised as steady, a glass from Marseille as cheerful, which means it ran fast and brightened the day. In some ports, inspectors visited chandlers with an expression that only a tape measure can produce. They checked neck diameters, weighed charges, and issued tags stamped with numbers that meant, among other things, that a man had a job. Once, in a docket from 1742, 2 chandlers argued over the legal meaning of clump. It went to a magistrate. He wrote that clump is when the stream is interrupted by an agglomeration contrary to intention. That sentence is not thrilling. It is, however, extremely useful if you wish to fall asleep on schedule. There were rituals. At 4 bells in the morning watch, someone brewed coffee that tasted like a conversation between smoke and patience. At 8 bells, the helmsman handed the wheel to a friend with a nod that meant both thank you and please do not hit anything. Before he left, he listened for the bell. If it seemed tardy, he glanced at the glass. If he found a clump, he teased it apart with a straw borrowed from the chicken coop, because efficient ships were also farms. The glass did not mind. It enjoyed attention and did not require applause. It only asked to be turned again and again, the way a pillow asks for a cooler side. On long voyages, the glass became part of the ship's small gossip. A favorite one might be nicknamed after a person ashore who moved gracefully. A troublesome one might be called Lawyer, for its habit of making minutes feel longer than they appeared on paper. When a new chronometer finally came aboard brass, precise, with a face that glittered faintly like a line from a sermon, the glass did not retire. It stayed on the shelf and continued to do the 2 jobs only it really loved, marking the watch and telling the cook when the pudding was ready. Even after steel ships and wireless sets arrived, the bell still said what it always said, and the glass still agreed at dignified intervals, because a chronometer will tell you the time. but it won't ask you to move. You can follow the glass ashore if you like. In monasteries, sand glasses measured the length of readings out loud, a spiritual version of the dog watch. In lighthouses, keepers turned small glasses to remind themselves when to trim wicks and polish lenses, because nothing throws a town into gossip like a dim lamp. In courts, a glass might limit the eloquence of an advocate who would otherwise explain the obvious until the jury formed a union. In kitchens, cooks knew that an egg does not consult a sundial, but it listens politely to a 3-minute fall of sand. Rope walks used them to let fibers rust between twistings. Printers used them to time ink drying so a page would not shake hands with the next. All these glasses ran on the same principle. The world is a little easier when something falls at a dependable speed. Manufacture improved and then improved again. Glassblowers learned to pull thinner necks without making them jealous. Millers discovered that eggshells must be ground under wooden rollers, not iron ones if you wish them to remain courteous in humidity. The best makers stored their fill in linen sacks sewn by grandmothers who thought nothing of precision. They smoked the inside of bulbs with a wisp of resin so stray grains would not cling. They etched a small mark near the waist for someone's thumb to find in the dark. A well-made glass felt calm. It asked for care, not ceremony. If you shook it, which was rude, it forgave you. If you turned it gently and at the right time, it rewarded you with a watch that ended in a bell and a sense that the world was not in a hurry to collapse. Of course, not everyone loved them. Some captains distrusted a technology that could be appended by a sneeze. Others considered the glass an accomplice to wool gathering because half an hour gives a person ideas. A few held that only the logbook mattered, since it used ink, and ink looks like history even when it is simply confidence made visible. But sailors are practical. If the glass helped divide labor into digestible pieces, kept men awake when fog made the horizon look like folded linen, and gave a ship a heartbeat that could be heard from the waist to the forecastle, then it had earned its keep. Besides, it had one unadvertised feature. It tolerated being stared at by tired people who needed an excuse to think about nothing. Watching grains fall is organized daydreaming. The sea approves. Chronometers finally replaced the glass for navigation, and thank heavens for that. Longitude became less of a parlor trick and more of a measurement, and lost islands quietly left the charts. But the bell routine survived. It still rings 8 times in a museum, and sometimes in a harbor, and always in stories told by people who remember ships as places where the day wore a neat uniform. The glass survives too, partly because it is a good teacher. Children learn patience by turning it, and adults remember budgets by watching it. Time passes, politely, within an object that can be put on a shelf while you fetch tea. It is, in its way, the least dramatic metaphor ever sold. There was, long ago, a sailor who carved a tiny fish on the wooden frame of his ship's glass. He did it with a knife that also cut rope and apples. The fish had 2 dots for eyes and a tail that suggested hope. Nobody wrote down why he did it. Perhaps it was a record of a quiet watch done well. Perhaps it was simply a way to say this hour belonged to him, and nobody else could have it. The carving stayed with the glass through 2 refits, a change of flag, and a short career as a kitchen timer in a port tavern where the cook believed eggs benefit from naval discipline. When the frame finally cracked and the bulbs were retired to a cabinet, the fish rested as a label for something small and faithful. Not important exactly, just regular. Regular can be a blessing. It's calming to think how many human decisions once traveled by grains. A course set, a watch ended, a coffee poured, a wick trimmed, a page turned, a rope given a moment to settle before the next twist. Each decision had the dignity of half an hour. The glass never raised its voice. It only kept the appointment that everything had with falling. You can hear it still if you want, which is to say, you can imagine the hiss of eggshell and marble and a trace of lead, a sound much quieter than trouble and much louder than panic. It is the sound of a ship that refuses to measure life in deadlines and chooses instead to file it in small, repeatable pieces that take turns. If you're still awake, the next turn is soon. Someone will lift the glass by its waist, rotate it as though proposing a toast to gravity, and set it down with a care born of repetition. Somewhere a bell will answer with one soft note, then two, an unhurried report that everything continues to happen. The cat under the shelf will open one eye in case there's cream. The cook will lean on an elbow and wait for the pudding to agree with the universe. Out on deck, a rope will twitch like a thought that isn't urgent. The chronometer in its mahogany box will keep exact time and be entirely ignored for the moment, because right now the ship is busy with the pleasant task of being between bells. You can be busy with that task too. The grains fall. The neck stays steady. The watch goes on until it doesn't, and then another begins, and nobody, not even the glass, feels the need to hurry the ending. You might not expect the quiet history of misplaced umbrellas to have a paperwork tradition, but it does, and it is a long one. Trains arrive, passengers disembark with most of their belongings, and then there's one handle left leaning politely where nobody will claim it. The porter picks it up as if it has confessed to a small offense. He knows what happens next. The umbrella joins a system with shelves, tags, and a smell like boiled dust. If you're still awake by the time we reach the brass ferrule classification forms, you may subscribe or simply think kindly of the subscribe button. No umbrella ledger has ever pressed anyone about it. Typical Victorian station kept a drying rack that looked like a modest forest. After a wet arrival, the rack filled up with sudden citizens, black silk canopies, oilcloth soldiers, cane shafts with the vanity of walking sticks, and the occasional green cotton specimen that admitted it had once lived as an awning. Attendants hung each piece to drip, because wet umbrellas write bad labels. The station master, who had a mustache that kept its own counsel, installed a low stove nearby to encourage evaporation without enthusiasm. Paper tags waited on a nail. A stamp pad waited beside them with a color the clerks described as station purple, which means any shade that hides ink fingers. The first rule of the rack was not moral but mechanical. Never let two open umbrellas touch. They will gossip, and the hinges will learn each other's bad habits. When the umbrellas were dry enough to tolerate adjectives, the inventory began. A patient clerk noted the essentials with a script that could have served tea: umbrella, gentleman's black silk, 8 ribs, horn crook. Found on up platform, 5:40 train, light drizzle. A second clerk disliked poetry and wrote, gents BLK, 8R horn. UP 5:40. Drizzle. Both entries communicated. Both allowed statistics to bloom later. The office used a template that asked the same quiet questions every time. Ribs. Canopy material, handle material, ferrule metal, length shut, length open condition, maker's mark if legible. Distinguishing whorls, if any. Distinguishing whorls included scrimshawed initials, scratches arranged like accidents, and once a tiny copper acorn set into the end of the crook, which dignified the umbrella without the owner's consent. The tags traveled from desk to desk like small passports. Each tag received a number stamped by a device that went chunk in a helpful way. The number lived in 3 places at once: on the tag, in the ledger, and on a card in an index drawer that reluctantly smelled of glue. The station called this a triangulation, although no mathematics occurred. If a claimant came in and said, "I lost a black umbrella," the clerk smiled with professional politeness the way a pharmacist smiles when someone asks for a cure for Wednesday. "What kind of handle?" he would ask. The claimant invariably said, "Wood." The clerk would look at him in a kindly manner that meant horn. "Bone, gutta percha, Malacca, Wangi." Ebony, beech, oak, ash, maple, bamboo, and wood are all cousins, and cousins should not be forced to share a name. Owners made the process livelier without speed. The correct answer about a lost umbrella is never black. The clerk wanted to hear about scars. Was there a mend on the third rib from the ferrule? Did the canopy have a watermark like a quiet continent? Was there string wrapped near the crook because someone once promised to replace it and did not? The oddest description on record is it closes with reluctance but eventually agrees, which the staff correctly identified. They could identify by sound as well. A tin ferrule taps like a penny on a saucer. Brass is more confident. Cane handles tick the counter like a metronome. Gutta percha thuds with intent. A very old umbrella sometimes sighs. The clerk preferred sighing ones because the casework moved faster when inanimate objects. Collaborated weather was the great accomplice. The umbrella office treated the sky like a partner who never wrote reports. The calendar showed little rainy parades noted in arithmetic pencil. Dr. 8:15, Phi rain after 5, mizzle a dot M. On those days, the rack grew a second rack. The station added a towel ration. Claimants arrived wet and grateful, and then soggy logic failed them. One gentleman tried to describe his umbrella as satisfactory. Another called his moderately comforting. The best adjective of the decade was ethical, which the clerk accepted without interrogation. The ledger allowed a marginal column for sky at time of finding, and those entries form a patient climatology. Wet, windy, wet but ashamed, gale, fine, unexpected, fog, umbrella unnecessary, followed by a smug increase in lost umbrellas, because objects are always most lost when they feel superfluous. There were policies about age. The office kept an umbrella for 3 months, 4 in sentimental towns. After that, the active stewardship matured into a sale, always on a Thursday at 2, when the staff believed the air sat best in the room. The auction attracted citizens who said they did not believe in auctions. They came for bargains and left with items that needed attention. The catalog descriptions were as soothing as an inventory of teaspoons. Lot 14, parasol, ivory knob, faint stain. Lot 22, umbrella, stout, recanopied. Lot 35, umbrella, uncertain, rib missing but straightforward. Proceeds paid for more tags, more purple blotting, and sometimes for the repair of a door that insisted on sticking when a north wind visited. There's a note in one book. Door rehung. Umbrellas calmer. Some stations developed reputations. Coastal depots with an appetite for weather collected the heavy sort sailors' oilskins reimagined as canopy. Handles cut from odd woods the sea had introduced. Metropolitan termini attracted walking stick umbrellas with aspirations. Mining towns saw a parade of straight handles with practical iron ferrules that could survive gravel. University towns suffered from idealism. Many pieces were constructed from materials the catalog called experimental and the staff called eager. In one city, a manufacturer experimented with a collapsible design that protested the concept of ribs. The office called them accordions and kept a special shelf for them far from the stove because they tended to rediscover themselves at inconvenient times. Repair culture was quiet but extensive. An umbrella was too dear to abandon without argument, and a rib could be mended by a man with pliers and a certain moral outlook. Station workshops carried spare stretchers, pins, caps, tips, and the elegant little collars that keep a canopy gathered as a respectable sleeve. A well-chosen length of wax thread could grant an umbrella another year of service, provided nobody asked it to face a moral storm. The ledger marked these modifications with the dry poetry of engineering. Third rib patched. Neat. Runner improved. Spring restored. Tension satisfactory. Collar replaced. Atmosphere optimistic. The station cat, an hourly employee whose job was to supervise, approved of thread but was deeply suspicious of gutta percha, perhaps because it tasted like regret. Outside the office, the umbrella had a social life. It stood as a surrogate person in entrances, like a quiet friend who holds the door. Households possess stands the way some people now possess charging stations. Stands had identities. Stately ones allowed 6 umbrellas to discuss the day at leisure. Modest ones apologized for being practical. In boarding houses, stands were often communal, and you can imagine the exchanges that ensued. I thought this was mine because it also detests wind, which was somehow not legally persuasive. Etiquette sneaked in, as it always does. Newspapers advised labeling your property with a visiting card tucked discreetly into the collar. The ink bled in rain, producing names that looked like confessions. Some people tied knotted yarn to the crook because memory enjoys crafts. Yarn seldom bleeds. The railway umbrella culture also generated numbers. Annual reports listed articles found, and the umbrella column, like a tall cousin, led the page respectfully. Totals swelled in autumn when confidence meets puddles. They declined a touch in harvest when it is difficult to misplace an umbrella among pumpkins, and rose again at Christmas because packages persuade people that their hands are full of everything, including handles they are not holding. The staff tabulated this without complaint. There was even talk in some offices of correlating umbrella loss with barometric readings. One earnest clerk drew a graph with lines so faint it was essentially a suggestion. He concluded that umbrellas are mislaid when the pressure drops and also when it rises, leaving most of the atmosphere implicated. The station master wrote at the margin, "Sensible." There were also falsehoods. Children sometimes attempted to claim an umbrella with a name that is not their name, because families have only so many umbrellas and rainfall does not accept excuses. A clerk would ask for a distinguishing mark. A child would invent sparkles on the inside, which betrayed an experience with the mechanics of rib sewing. Adults erred in new ways. A businessman insisted that the handle of his umbrella knew him. The clerk invited a demonstration. The umbrella did not reciprocate. Everyone allowed the moment to pass like a little cloud. In a seaside town, a lady attempted to describe her parasol as structural shade, which the clerk enjoyed enough to accept without precedent. There is a memo afterward. Admit structural shade henceforth. Not as umbrella, but as cousin. And then there were the umbrellas with biographies. One had a dent in the ferrule shaped like a comma from being shut in the same. Cabbed door several times by someone who was polite but hurried. Another bore the mark of a dog who had decided to retrieve it briefly and reconsidered mid-corridor. A third carried 3 men's by 3 different hands, each with a different theory of knots, all somehow cooperative. This last one returned to the station every few months, as though it found travel restful. The ledger noted in a placid way, "No, 6,239 claims familiarity with staff," when eventually an elderly gentleman claimed it with a smile that fit. The office recorded the reunion as amicable. The umbrella never visited again, which implies a plain kind of happiness. Administration produced its own small music. The chute from the platform to the office thudded when an object arrived with ambition. The date stamp said its piece, always convinced. The pencil sharpener hummed like a B major hymn. The ledger pages turned with a dry applause. No incident ever fully disturbed this orchestra. In one heavy storm, a drip found the corner of the index drawer and smudged 4 cards. The staff reconstructed them from memory, which is how you learn that clerks can remember the number of ribs of a stranger's umbrella for years. They cannot recall names because names change. Rib counts do not. The umbrella world touched laws lightly. Railway companies printed notices that explained the conditions of custody. Articles not reclaimed within 3 calendar months shall be disposed of by public auction. they said, and people nodded as if hearing a blessing. The phrase calendar month mattered because a lunar one would be too charming. Some offices posted moral axioms. Claimants to describe, not choose, was a favorite. So as the company regrets character and affection cannot be identified by sight. Readiness with forms was praised. The least popular phrase was kindly initial here, written there in a hand that had initialed many things already. Eventually, the 20th century found new ways to forget. Cars, cinemas, elevators, department stores, with enough entrances to confuse geography. The umbrella adapted to each like furniture. There were umbrella stands in theaters where the comedies were worst. You could measure laughter by the dampness of the aisle. There were stands in restaurants with pasta ambitions, and in offices where the umbrella began to share space with walking sticks, golf clubs, samples, posters for products that did not exist yet, and a potted plant that learned to accept drips as conversation. Lost property offices multiplied and then combined, like bus routes that developed theories. The ledgers thickened and then grew thin as card became punch card, and punch card became a screen that never collected dust. Even modern systems kept an analog island, a shelf for drying, a paper tag when printers sulked, a bell that summoned the clerk from the back room where broken ribs quietly asked for second chances. Airports introduced a new category umbrellas that had visited countries their owners hadn't. These often arrived black and left black, but with stories that customs did not ask for. Underground trains added another shelf and a sign that simultaneously discouraged luggage and encouraged faith. If your property finds its way to us, we will speak softly to it, one sign almost said. In offices that service many languages, umbrella translated into shapes, and clerks became experts in drawing crooks that make sense to strangers. The most boring and somehow consoling fact of the umbrella records is the steadiness of the numbers. People lost them when it rained and more when it didn't. People found them again by describing the wrong thing until they remembered the right thing. Staff verified with patience. The statistics curve like gently folded laundry across decades. A century and a half of entries reads like one person, absent-minded and good, learning the same lesson calmly. Modern plastics change the cost, but not the narrative. A 10 ribs fiberglass contraption with a sensational color insists on being cataloged with the same questions that once served a silk canopy with Malacca dignity. What is the handle? What does the ferrule say when it meets the countertop? Is there a men near the third rib? Little questions make large cities gentle. A few umbrella offices grew museums in self-defense. Visitors can view a chronological wall of handles bone, horn, gutta percha, wood with pride, aluminum with speed, acrylic with frankness, and a wide round parasol that looks slightly embarrassed to have survived so well. There is usually a showcase for curiosities, the one with the silver dog's head that unscrews to reveal a vial for something cheerful, the one that hides a flute, the one that pretends to be a sword but is secretly a tape measure because the owner valued. Knowing links more than dual options. Curators write labels that are polite about function. Handle with animal motif. Loyalty uncertain. Parasol with fringe. Shade honest. Visitors move slowly and nod like people reading the minutes of a meeting that ran long but ended kindly. The best thing about the umbrella system, if you are trying to sleep, is how softly it rewards accuracy. The right detail brings a quiet reunion. A man says, "Mine has 2 stitches done in blue thread near the runner." The clerk lifts an eyebrow in a curtain. There it is, a very small truth nestled among practical truths. The transaction lasts a minute and saves a day. The ledger makes a note, and the note becomes history even though it is smaller than most memories. There's no triumph in it, only the satisfaction of a screw settling into wood without squeak. A boring miracle repeated. If you wonder whether any umbrella is never claimed because it enjoys the routine, the drying, the tagging, the gossip of ferals, you are thinking like a clerk after 4 on a Thursday. The answer is that some umbrellas seem to prefer public life. They behave so well on the rack that the attendants claim them with their eyes before they auction and make a case for adoption. Contracts permit it. The adopted ones obtain more mens than usual and acquire a small swagger in rain. There's at least one station where a staff umbrella is lent to late passengers with the promise that it will be returned by someone's cousin. It always is. Umbrellas like uncles. We could end at policy, but policy is a cupboard. The thing itself is a hand with a handle in it. Another hand touching the world lightly with a stick. A series of ribs that hold a small ceiling above. And the sound of rain arguing with woven fabric and losing with good manners. On a platform, the bell announces a departure, and someone looks around and decides to leave the umbrella behind because the sky looks apologetic now. The porter will sigh without malice and add another patient line to the ledger. Umbrella. Hopeful. Found smiling. This is, strictly speaking, not an objective description, but the ledger has learned over time that a little kindness keeps better than dust. If you are still awake, imagine a shelf that smells of old ink and dry cotton. A clerk turns the pages with care that is not nervous. He likes watching numbers behave. The clock above the door promises that there will be a Thursday again, which is all any office requires. Outside, rain will begin, or it will not. The door will open with a sound like a bass note clearing its throat, and someone will step in with the posture of a person composing a description. The clerk will reach for a tag, already numbered by a machine that enjoys its job. Between them, a small history will be written that nobody will read twice, and that will nevertheless exist, which is the kind of history that helps the world sleep. The umbrellas on the rack will breathe their thin canvas breaths, which is not science but feels true enough for now.